About 2 years ago, I was driving home from a family reunion late at night. The drive was about 2 hours, and I didn't stay overnight because I had to be back for work the following day. Most of the drive was on roads lined with dense bushes and trees on either side, the kind you often see in creepy movies. After about 45 minutes of driving, I started to feel incredibly tired. You know how sometimes fatigue just hits you out of nowhere? That's exactly what happened to me. I knew I couldn't continue driving safely, but I couldn't find a suitable place to park and sleep. Realizing that I wasn't going to find a safe spot and my tiredness wasn't going away, I made a questionable decision. I pulled over to the side of the road onto the grass, hiding my car behind some bushes to stay out of sight from passing cars, which were infrequent but not non-existent. I noted the time, 11:22 p.m., and then I fell asleep. Sometime later, I was awakened by a scratching sound. I glanced at the clock. It was 11:50 p.m. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and because I was still extremely tired, I didn't bother looking around and went back to sleep. I was later awakened by the same sound, and this time it was 12:40 a.m. This really freaked me out because the sound didn't stop. At first, I thought it might just be an animal inspecting the car, but then I wondered why it would come back almost an hour later. I looked in my rearview mirror and managed to catch a glimpse of something running away into the forest. At that moment, I thought of the urban legend about the hook-handed killer who scratched a couple's car and then attacked the guy when he got out to investigate. No way was I sticking around for that. I quickly got back on the road. Just 100 yards up the road, I came around a bend and saw a car parked off to the side with the driver's side door open. I slowed down to see if anyone was inside, but there wasn't. Then, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw nothing. Suddenly, a man came sprinting around the corner, screaming at me, "Hey! Hey you! Get the fuck out of your car! Now!" I panicked and sped off as fast as I could. I never saw that guy again. Moral of the story? Don't ever sleep on the side of a deserted road. I lived in a bizarre little house as a child. It was incredibly tall and thin, like a detached townhouse, with 3 floors, a basement, and an attic. The house was full of quirks, such as 2 fully functional fireplaces, a shower stall in the center of the basement, a backyard so small you couldn't take 5 paces without hitting the fence, and an old-fashioned rope-pull dumbwaiter that led from the kitchen to my bedroom. I loved that weird little place, but it was incredibly old. Part of its charm was that it seemed to have been designed by a group of eccentric individuals. Eventually, the repair costs exceeded what my parents were willing to invest, and we had to move. Preparing for the move was a chore. I packed most of my belongings myself. I took to throwing things down the dumbwaiter and stuffing all my clothes so thickly into my closet that they formed a single, solid brick of fabric. While clearing out that closet, I discovered something I hadn't noticed before, an attic entrance in the ceiling. Being an adventurous kid, I opened it up, stood on the clothes brick, and embarked on my first and last exploration of the topmost part of our quirky little house. The first thing I noticed was that it wasn't as dark as I expected. The attic was strung with old, red Christmas lights that still glowed faintly, and a dozen little cracks and holes peeped down into the bedrooms below. The second thing I noticed was that the attic was set up for habitation. The insulation was covered with plastic, there was an old gurney piled with sleeping bags and sheets, and a rusted mint green refrigerator that still worked when I tested it. The third thing I noticed was the bones. There were a lot of bones. As a child with a limited understanding of anatomy, I couldn't identify them all, but there were bones of all types heaped into piles around the center of the attic. Small and large, clean and white, from every imaginable sort of creature, haphazardly stacked in half a dozen clumps. 2 of the piles were blackened, as if someone had tried to burn them, and the walls nearest those blackened piles were scrawled with dark, bone-char messages. Mostly they were just smears, but the word sorry appeared more than once. that room had been sitting over my head for 8 years while I slept. When I was in high school, I had a good friend who lived next door to a house that was always up for sale. People would move out in the middle of the night without a word, and it hadn't had the same owner for more than 6 months straight for a couple of years. One night, we were really bored, and he suggested we go explore the house next door since it had sat empty for a while. We went around back and found a dog door that he could crawl through. He unlocked the door and let me in. The house itself was unremarkable. It looked like it was built in the 1950s and was a craftsman-style house in an older, nicer part of town. My friend's house was similarly built. The kitchen had a really nice built-in breakfast table set against a picture window. The house's electricity was off, but you could see the street light through the window. My friend and I sat down on the floor, across from this table, and were just hanging out, talking. Why? Who knows? Suddenly, my friend screamed, and in that instant, my vision went black. It wasn't just that I couldn't see, my body was engulfed in this sickly coldness from head to toe. I started screaming, and I felt my friend's hand grabbing mine and pulling me forcefully in some direction. My vision slowly came back, and I started to warm up when I realized we were outside under the street light. It was December, and it should have been much warmer inside that house. Finally, I looked at my friend, and he looked scared. I was really confused and kind of panicked myself. I finally asked him what happened. He said that as I was talking, a black figure, with the vague shape of a girl, crawled out from under the table and sat on top of me. Apparently, I started groping around with my eyes wide open, like I couldn't see, and he was so freaked out he pulled me out of the house. We're still friends, and we bring it up every now and then, but the story itself never changes, and it still sends chills down my spine. To this day, I've never felt such blackness or coldness in my life. It was palpable, almost sticky. For a couple of days afterward, I couldn't shake this unsettling feeling, and I could never walk past that house again. Ugh. I'm scared to get out of bed now. Every time I stay at my grandma's house, I hear someone walking upstairs. It starts on one side of the room, casually walks to the other, and then stops. This happens maybe twice a night. I didn't start hearing it until I was about 14, which was when my grandparents made me start sleeping in a different room on the first floor after they began sleeping in separate bedrooms. Both of their rooms are also on the first floor, so the upstairs was left empty. For some backstory, I've always been afraid of the upstairs in their house. I don't know why, but it's always freaked me out, and I refuse to ever go up there alone. I'm 23 now, and I still won't go up alone. There's one room specifically that really terrifies me. It's a long, narrow bedroom. When you open the door, there are closets on your left and right, a bed placed roughly in the middle of the room, and a window on the far side, opposite the door. Growing up, my grandparents told me that the sons of the previous owner claimed to see a gorilla come out of the closet at night, dance around the room, and then go back into the closet. I didn't think much of this story until I had to start sleeping in the room directly below that creepy room upstairs. One night, we all went to bed. All the lights in the house were off, and I was still awake, lying on the bed. That's when I heard it. Thump, 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 starting at one end of the room upstairs. It got closer, passed right above me, and continued to the other end of the room, where it stopped. I was wide awake, terrified out of my mind. There was no question that I had heard footsteps. I recognized that slow, casual pace. Freaked out, I went to my grandpa's room. I told him what I'd heard, but he just said the house was old and creaked a lot. Still, he turned on the dining room light for me, which made me feel a little safer. I tried to go back to sleep. Then it started again, this time from where it had stopped earlier, by the window upstairs. It walked over me again and stopped when it reached the door. I thought it was over until, 5 seconds later, I heard it coming down the stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, silence as it reached the landing, then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and silence again as it reached the first floor. I was frozen in shock. Whatever it was on my floor of the house, and sadly, the dining room light did nothing to stop it. I stared at the doorway to my room, with the dining room light shining in, and my vision began to distort. I felt dizzy with fear, so I pulled the blankets over my head and suddenly heard a scratching sound from inside my room. I knew exactly where it was coming from, my grandpa's gun case. The sound was unmistakable, long scratches down the front of the gun case door. I could even hear the door slightly tapping against the frame as each scratch began. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I took a deep breath and finally let out a loud scream. Within seconds, my grandpa rushed into my room, and I was relieved. But he still didn't believe me. So, I did what any normal person would do. I draped a sheet over the side of the bed and slept underneath it. I wrapped myself tight in a comforter, put on headphones, and turned my back to the door. There could have been a party of ghosts in my room, and I wouldn't have known. The next morning, my grandpa told my grandma what had happened the night before. She just said, "Oh, that's silly. You know, your cousin woke me up the last time she stayed here. She came into my room saying, 'I hear footsteps.' After that, I spent the rest of my week there sleeping under the bed. I've stayed there countless times since that happened, and I still hear the footsteps every time. I sleep on top of the bed now, but always keep my back to the door and wear headphones. I haven't heard it come down the stairs again since that first night, but if it does, I don't want to know." About a month ago, I went over to my girlfriend's house, but something felt off as soon as I stepped into the living room. I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling, and it turns out they had recently replaced a china cabinet with one that had belonged to her grandmother, who had passed away a few months earlier. Her grandmother had been bedridden in the hospital, so I never got the chance to meet her. Being around her grandmother's furniture made me feel incredibly anxious and strangely sad. When I mentioned this to my girlfriend, she brushed it off, saying it was probably nothing, and then went to the bathroom. Left alone, I found myself drawn to the cabinet. It stood about 6 feet tall, made of dark wood, with 2 side doors and a glass front, and at the back, there was a mirror. As I was looking at the teacups and small baby dolls inside, I suddenly thought I saw someone in the mirror behind me, a silhouette. Startled, I called out to my girlfriend, but before I could finish, I heard a shrill scream coming from the bathroom. I rushed to the bathroom door and started pounding on it. When it finally opened, I found her sitting on the floor, crying. She said she had seen someone in the bathroom mirror. Without thinking, we bolted out of her house, no shoes, no jackets, nothing. We just ran straight to my car, and I drove aimlessly for about an hour, not knowing where to go. When I eventually brought her back home, her mom was sitting on the doorstep. She told us she had been seeing shadows moving around the house. Normally, I'm the kind of person who seeks out these experiences. If someone says their house is haunted, I want to see it. If someone thinks they saw a skinwalker, my friends and I will go looking. I've never found anything until this. This was something else entirely. When I was younger, I visited the Manassas battlefield with my father. We were sitting on the tailgate of his truck, enjoying some McDonald's while looking out at the cannons on top of a hill. It was a foggy, misty day with a slight chill in the air, probably around November. Suddenly, we noticed a man dressed in full Civil War attire, standing by the cannons about 50 to 100 meters away. He was waving at us, a slow, beckoning wave. My dad, who had brought along a pair of binoculars, took a closer look and confirmed the man was wearing a Confederate uniform. The man stood still, only moving his arm to wave us over. My dad assumed there was a reenactment happening and thought the man might need help, so he decided to walk down to him. I stayed by the truck, watching through the binoculars. As my dad approached the man, he suddenly stopped in his tracks and seemed confused. After a few seconds, he turned and sprinted back to me, visibly shaken. He quickly threw everything into the back of the truck, and we left the battlefield in a hurry. When we were safely away, my dad explained that as he got closer, the man slowly disappeared right in front of him. He said he felt a strange, unsettling feeling in his stomach and got chills all over. To this day, my dad still gets goosebumps when he tells the story, and this is a man who saw combat in Vietnam, so he's not easily scared. From my perspective, even though I was watching the entire time, I never saw the man disappear. We still don't know exactly what we saw that day, but I believe it might have been the ghost of a Confederate soldier. I woke up to the sound of rattling downstairs. The clock on my nightstand read 3:34 a.m. I was 17 at the time, lying in my pitch-black bedroom, heart pounding with fear. Trying to stay quiet, I tiptoed to my parents' room, but to my surprise, it was empty. Where could my parents be at 3:34 in the morning? Feeling uneasy, I headed upstairs to check on my brother. He was usually awake all night, but when I reached his room, the light was on, yet he was nowhere to be found. The unsettling noises downstairs must have been them, right? But why were they awake so late? Did something happen to someone? I cautiously made my way downstairs, only to find two men in the middle of our living room, seemingly in the act of stealing our TV. Panic surged through me as I realized I was alone. I turned and fled back upstairs as quietly as I could, shut myself in my bedroom, and locked the door. Suddenly, loud banging erupted on the other side of the door. Then, I woke up, relief washing over me as I realized it was just a dream. But when I glanced at the clock, a chill ran down my spine. It was 3:34 a.m. again, just like in the dream. Shaking with fear, I decided to go downstairs, hoping to reassure myself that everything was fine. As I descended, dread filled me when I saw the two men in the kitchen, this time screaming at my parents and brother. I bolted back upstairs, locked myself in my bedroom, and braced for what felt inevitable. 10 seconds later, the banging on my door began again. And then, I woke up, for real this time. The clock still read 3:34 a.m. This time, I was truly awake, and I couldn't fall back asleep for the next 36 hours. When I was a child, I lived in an old Victorian house with my single mother. As an only child, my nights were often quiet, except for the unsettling laughter I would hear when I was trying to sleep. I was around 5 or 6 years old when I first began waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of laughter echoing in the hallway. When I told my mom about it, she assured me it was probably just the TV being left on late. But one night, the laughter wasn't just in the hallway, it was in my room. I woke up and tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. It felt like invisible hands were pinning me down, gripping my shoulders tightly while the laughter filled the room. I was terrified and screamed as loud as I could. My mom rushed into my room, flicking on the bedside lamp. She tried to convince me that it was just a bad dream. But when I told her my shoulders hurt, she grew concerned. She lifted my t-shirt and found 2 adult-sized handprints on my shoulders. For years, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But just the other day, I casually mentioned it to my mom. She went pale and quietly said, "I don't want to remember that." It's not something I talk about often, but when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I experienced something that still gives me chills. One night, I woke up to a banging on my window. At first, I tried to brush it off as just the wind, hoping to fall back asleep. But then I started hearing footsteps in my room. My bedroom was large enough for someone to walk in circles in front of my bed, and that's exactly what it sounded like, someone pacing around in the dark. I tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling, but the sound of those footsteps made my heart race. To make things worse, I used to sleep with the radio on, and at that very moment, it was playing a hauntingly depressing song. I can't remember the name of the song, but even now, whenever I hear it, I still get the creeps. As I lay there, frozen with fear, I noticed that the room was getting colder and colder. I was terrified. I decided to make a run for it, bolting down the hall to my parents' room. But as I passed through the spot where I heard the footsteps, the air turned so icy that I could see my breath. For a split second, I was paralyzed by the cold, and that's when I heard it, a voice, barely more than a whisper, saying, "I'm lost." I didn't wait another second. I sprinted to my parents' room, dove under their bed, and cried myself to sleep, desperately trying to escape the fears that gripped me. When I was about 13 or 14, I lived on a farm in North Carolina. Unlike typical farms with fields of crops, ours was a pine tree plantation. Pine needles are a valuable landscaping commodity, so we essentially lived in a forest, harvesting pine straw annually. Our house was situated in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly aligned longleaf pines. The living room of our house featured a massive picture window, stretching nearly the entire length of the 50-foot room. The house itself was a peculiar custom build from the 1930s, designed by a dentist, and sat on a gentle hill. This elevation meant that the living room was about 5 or 6 feet above ground level, offering a vantage point overlooking a solid mile of pine trees. During winter, the scene could be unsettling. A light dusting of snow would reflect the moonlight, allowing us to see our dogs roaming around at night. To be honest, that room and its enormous window always gave me the creeps. One weekend, I had my cousin over, and we were doing what kids do in the countryside, tossing random things into the fireplace to see how they'd react. As the night wore on and the fire dwindled, we built a grand fort out of couch cushions and blankets in the living room, preparing to sleep there. Everything was ordinary until we heard our dogs barking. Their barks sounded distant, suggesting they were somewhere on the property chasing off nocturnal animals. My cousin began staring out the expansive window, silent and fixated. Sensing something was off, I asked, "What's up?" He murmured that he felt like he was seeing things. Anxiety bubbled up inside me as I joined him, pressing my face against the cold glass, scanning the moonlit expanse of trees. For several minutes, nothing happened. I peppered him with questions, but he shushed me, trying to concentrate. Then, we both saw it, a shadowy figure moving from one tree to another, not running or leaping, just a brisk walk. This figure was approximately 100 yards from the house. Given the moonlight reflecting off the snowy ground, it was hard to discern if the person was approaching. Oddly, we didn't immediately panic. There was a part of us that doubted what we saw, thinking our eyes might be playing tricks. We considered waking my dad, but hesitated because he's the type who would step onto the patio with his rifle and shout into the woods, a prospect that felt more terrifying than the unknown outside. We were scared but agreed not to provoke whatever was out there. Over the next half hour, the unsettling sightings continued. Every few minutes, we'd spot another figure, sometimes about 50 feet from the previous sighting, moving between trees. There were at least 2 figures, appearing and vanishing intermittently. It's worth noting that we didn't have nearby neighbors. The land surrounding our farm was owned by federal paper, I'm not sure who owns it now, consisting of miles upon miles of untouched trees. Seeing anyone near our property, especially at night, was highly unusual unless they had a purpose for being there. As we continued to watch, one of the figures appeared again, but this time, instead of disappearing behind a tree, it started running towards us. That was our breaking point. We lost our composure and rushed to wake my dad. By the time we dragged him, half asleep, into the living room, the figures were gone. Nonetheless, we frantically went around locking every door and window. Living in such a remote area, we rarely locked anything, so this act was both unusual and nerve-wracking. Each door we approached carried the dread of possibly confronting whoever was outside, though thankfully, that never happened. After securing the house, we convinced my dad to sleep in the living room with us as we kept vigil by the window. I never understood why he didn't call the police. He always had a "we take care of our own" mindset, making dialing 911 seem out of the question. The following day, curiosity drove us to investigate. Sure enough, the snow bore footprints everywhere. We saw tracks between the trees and, most chillingly, right in front of our massive window. Given the living room's elevation, about 7 feet above ground, the figures would have been standing just beneath our line of sight, unseen yet uncomfortably close. When I was 13, my family and I were living with my grandparents. In my aunt's room, there was a 2-foot-tall Victorian-style doll that had been converted into a lamp. To turn it on, you had to hold the doll's cold, plastic hand and raise or lower its arm. The doll stood on a nightstand next to my aunt's bed, facing the door, greeting everyone who entered with a creepy, dead-eyed smile. One day, I was alone in the house and needed a blanket from my aunt's closet. Fortunately for me, there were 2 factors that worked in my favor. 1, it was mid-afternoon, so I didn't need to turn on the lamp, and 2, the closet was conveniently located right next to the door. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor as I entered the room, not daring to look at the doll. I quickly turned to face the closet, my back now towards the doll, and opened the door to grab a blanket. But as I reached down, I noticed something was different. The room seemed brighter. The light was on. The tiny hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I froze, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. My survival instinct kicked in, telling me to run, but before I could move, I made the mistake of looking back. I wish I hadn't looked. When I turned to exit the room, I saw that the doll's hand was raised, pointing directly at me. That haunting image has been burned into my memory ever since. I may have shared this before, but I don't quite remember. This happened when I was in high school, sitting at the dining room table doing homework. From where I sat, I had a clear view of the front door. Our front door at the time had a pane of glass about 2 by 5 feet, with a lace curtain draped over it. It was probably around 9 p.m., and the night outside was pitch black. The porch light wasn't on, so the only illumination was from inside the house. Suddenly, I heard a noise, like someone was on the porch. My attention was immediately drawn to the front door. As I watched, I saw the screen door slowly opening. It stayed open for what felt like an eternity, but there was no one there, or, if there was, they were dressed completely in black. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, just as slowly, the screen door began to close. It didn't slam shut. Instead, it was eased back into place as if someone was deliberately trying to be quiet. After that, I don't clearly remember if I heard footsteps or not. Maybe whoever was there saw me watching and decided to slip away quietly. When I was around 17, my uncle, who ran a house painting business, often hired me to help him during the summer and fall. He was a hard worker, painting houses to make a living. His truck was fully equipped, complete with a company name and number on the side, and all the necessary supplies in the back. We often worked together, and while painting houses was usually uneventful, there was one experience I'll never forget. That fall, the weather was unusually wet, with rain almost every day. Because of this, our work kept getting delayed, and we ended up juggling multiple jobs at once. One of these jobs was an old Victorian house located in a quiet part of town. The house belonged to a lady and her husband, who was an author. Due to the constant rain and some family issues my uncle was dealing with, the job was taking much longer than expected. One day, the lady called my uncle, explaining that her husband was struggling to write his next book because the scaffolding outside was distracting him. She asked if we could come over and finish the job as soon as possible. My uncle, being the honest businessman he was, didn't want to disappoint them, so he prioritized their house. After all, it would only take a day or two to finish. We arrived at the house in the early afternoon. Despite it being fall, the day was unusually warm, but there was a distinct chill in the air that seemed to seep into your bones. The sky was overcast, and everything was cloaked in gray, giving the day an eerie, almost haunting atmosphere, like something out of a mystery novel. The front of the house was already painted, so we went around to the back to continue the work. My uncle, being the more experienced painter, handled the touch-ups while I applied the first coats. He asked if I was afraid of heights, and although they made me uneasy, I didn't want to seem childish in front of him, so I said no. He smiled and had me climb up the scaffolding to the 3rd floor to paint an upper section of the house. There was a small oval window up there that looked into the attic, which also happened to be the husband's study where he did most of his writing. As I climbed up the scaffolding, with cans of paint dangling behind me and various tools in the utility belt my uncle let me borrow, I reached the top and started painting, just like I had done many times before. Despite the unsettling weather and the strange calm that hung in the air, it felt like any other day on the job. That is, until I reached the window. As I bent down to dip my paintbrush, I glanced into the window and saw the husband staring back at me. His face was completely devoid of any emotion, just a blank, empty stare. It was the most lifeless expression I'd ever seen. Startled, I took a step back, trying to shake off the discomfort. I managed a nervous smile, but he didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised a pistol to his head and, without breaking eye contact, pulled the trigger. I was in utter shock. My mind couldn't process what had just happened. I gasped and let out a small scream, instinctively stepping back in fear. But in my panic, I took one step too many and fell off the scaffolding. My uncle, alerted by the gunshot, looked up just in time to see me plummeting from the third story. Thankfully, I landed in a bush, suffering only a broken ankle and a few scratches, but the psychological wounds ran much deeper. I had to go to counseling for a while after that. Even now, years later, I can still vividly recall that man's face, so devoid of any feeling, so utterly numb. It's burned into my memory. I've come to understand why he looked like that. He had given up, worn down by depression, marital issues, and the weight of too many whiskey-fueled nights. The burden of writer's block had pushed him to the edge, and he decided he couldn't take it anymore. His wife moved out of the house shortly after the incident, and we never finished the job. To this day, the house remains abandoned, and I avoid driving down that street. I'm afraid that if I do, I might look up at that window and see him staring back at me, cold, emotionless, and forever haunting. When I was 17 or 18, my family lived in a small village called Shipton Bellinger in Hampshire, England. The village was nestled between two nearby towns that formed a sort of oval route. I've always had trouble sleeping, and at that time, I was getting really into fitness. To help tire myself out, I started going for late-night runs, usually around midnight or 1 a.m., taking that oval route. The run was a couple of miles long and did a good job of exhausting me. One night, I was nearing the end of my usual circuit. I had run through Tidworth and was heading back up towards Ludgershall. For those unfamiliar with the area, there's a secondary school called Castledown near a back road that leads toward my village. This road is completely unlit, with dense trees on either side and open fields beyond them. As I stopped under a street lamp outside the school to tighten my laces, I heard a loud noise coming from the woods. At first, I figured it was just a deer or some other animal. I finished tying my laces and started jogging down the road. But the noises kept getting louder and closer. I could hear something moving quickly through the woods, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of a metal fence rattling, as if something was climbing over it. In that instant, pure fear took over. I sprinted down that dark road as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The entire mile, I kept repeating to myself, if it can catch me, it deserves me, and don't waste time looking, you know it's there, just run. I was absolutely terrified. When I finally reached the village, I stopped to catch my breath and glanced back into the darkness to see if anything had followed me. After a minute, I couldn't see or hear anything, so I ran straight to my house. To this day, I have no idea what was in those woods. Whether it was a person or an animal, I'm just grateful I never found out. I'm a pilot, and one time during a flight, I saw something that still baffles me. As I was cruising along, I noticed a bright orange, glowing object hovering just above the treetops. It was moving erratically, almost like a ball attached to an elastic string, bouncing around in random patterns. Curious and slightly concerned, I contacted Air Traffic Control, ATC, to see if they had anything on their radar. They reported nothing unusual and asked me to describe what I was seeing. I gave them a detailed account, but they still couldn't detect anything and were unaware of any military activity in the area. Suddenly, the object shot straight up into the sky and vanished in an instant. I informed ATC that it was gone, and they asked if I wanted to file a UFO report. I quickly declined, joking that it was probably just a weather balloon, and continued on my way. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a balloon. The incident left me uneasy. We often talk about how little we know about the ocean, but at least the ocean is a finite entity. What lies beyond the blue sky, in the infinite expanse of space, is something we know almost nothing about. And that thought is far more unsettling.